Unbelievable.
There is time only for fear.
A hacker.
Piercing pain of panic. Do we pray?
I'd like to thank Simon Boswell, composer of the soundtrack for Hackers, and Guy Pratt, who contributed a couple of great tracks, for joining me today to talk about the 25th anniversary re-release of the album. It's the first time the definitive soundtrack has been released. We've got a couple of tracks, notably the tracks by Guy and David Gilmour, and also Massive Attack and Left Field that we didn't have in the previous soundtrack that was released around about the time that the film came out. It's going to be a double album on vinyl and CD. But I just want us, first of all, to look back to the time when we were putting the film together and just ask you how much you were aware of the music and the bands and DJs that we used at the time. Because it was really Blur and Oasis that were in the ascendancy, certainly in London, where we mainly filmed Hackers. And we were coming out of the back of grunge.
Well, I was very much aware of that because I've been working with the Orb since they started, which is kind of the first wave of all that, and I knew the KLF guys and everything, and so there was that whole thing that grew out of like the Heavenly Social Club on Sundays afternoons, wasn't there? And it became, well, I think Big Beat became the umbrella term for all of it. Then it then became electronica, and then became ambient dub, ambient house. And yeah, but it was funny because it seemed to be, it wasn't mutually exclusive with the whole Britpop thing. It seemed there was like, it basically, you'd go to a gig and see Blur or Oasis, and then you'd go to a club and listen to Left Field, and everyone was wearing the same trainers.
Well, I certainly was aware of what was going on, and the kind of rave culture, though I've said this quite a few times in interviews. I was so busy as a film composer in the 90s that I never attended a rave or even took ecstasy during the 1990s whatsoever. But I was certainly aware of that culture, and I'd been a record producer, quite actively, and still was, and particularly became aware of the Chemical Brothers, Block Rockin' Beats, when they sampled the bass line from a track I produced called Coup, just 23 Skidoo. And so there was all kinds of weirdness going on about that, but I was certainly aware of them. And I wasn't aware of what you were picking, Ian, until a little bit later in the process. I mean, I know you played me a few things, and I have a DAT upstairs, I think, of all the things you were considering at the time, which was Orbital and Prodigy, etc., etc. And I obviously needed to know what I was seeing in and out of from the point of view of the original music.
We started the film with an Orbital track, Halcyon On and On, which sort of I used as score.
That whole intro thing of kind of with the track going of the New York skyline from above turning into that circuit board, which has become basically a pretty iconic thing, which is, it's been Nick, certainly the idea of it many times.
There's one thing that, as I remember though, which was a slight added complication for me when I was writing the score. Honestly, I've had this conversation a lot about the difference between score and tracks in a film and what their function is. Clearly, score is invisible to a certain extent to the actors. It's something they're not aware of, and you're describing or embellishing the experience for the viewer. Whereas tracks can be used as what they call source. In other words, they come playing from a radio or from headphones, and they're sort of heard by the actors. And then there's tracks which go on there which are sort of montage. There were quite a few montages in Hackers actually, where the tracks work really effectively. I've had this conversation with several directors though about the difference of what you're trying to do. I especially had quite a angry exchange with Danny Boyle about this during Trainspotting, because I think if you look carefully on lots of movies, if you put well-known tracks in there, you do risk the danger of taking the audience out of the action, sort of out of the movie a bit. And you find that they're tapping their feet along to something that they know, as opposed to it being something which is describing what they're watching, drawing them into a film. So there's a very delicate balance, which I think you achieved incredibly effectively in Hackers.
Talk to me.
I got it. But listen, Kate didn't know what's on it. I mean, she came to me to figure it out. She's not the one who planted the virus. You leave her alone.
Hey, don't worry, kid. If she's innocent, she'll be fine. Your mommy's safe now, okay?
But so I avoided doing anything that had a real dance connotation, because I knew that we were getting a lot of that stuff. So I knew I had everything I did, and it's all synthesizers, it's all electronica. There's not a real instrument. Well, actually, there's some backwards guitar in there. So I was trying to reflect a different angle from the film, which I think you were with the tracks, both of you two. And I saw this kind of psychedelic content in it, which is interesting. And in fact, Mark Kermode's notes, I read what he wrote for the track, for the sleeve of this release, and he was saying that you used what became Christopher Nolan's visual effects team, sort of cut their teeth on doing all the interiors of the computers, which are utterly brilliant, but I found it very psychedelic, and I found my score reflecting that sort of psychedelicness, especially in bits where, like I used the Mellotron sound from Strawberry Fields Forever, which I'm obsessed with. I've used it a lot. And I found that was a really interesting route for me, backwards guitars and kind of almost sort of 60s weird acid stuff.
Well, it's really interesting you say that, because that was very intentional, right, and actually explicit at different times in the film. When I first read the script, the club that became Cyberdelia, which was a name that I came up with for it, was I think a coffee bar, just like a sort of a chain coffee bar in the script. And I said this had to be this kind of psychedelic, cyberdelic place. And we actually talked about the cyberdelic palette of colours that we used. There was a lot of interest in fractals at the time, and we were talking to people in Silicon Valley, who were a lot of the people who were kind of inheriting the sort of the hippie, new frontier, unregulated, kind of outlaw, kind of outside legal constraints, free thinking kind of philosophy was very, very similar. The Grateful Dead concerts were where the guys that became Apple sold these little boxes where you could use sounds down the telephone lines to get cheaper long distance calls, because they were concerned that they were aware that the phone companies were ripping everybody off by charging way more than it was actually costing the phone company. So there was very much that conscious thing of making that this was a kind of it was like a cyberdelic. It was like a technology trip, and the way that we went inside the computers was absolutely intentional. And I think it answers that question about that dividing line between score and soundtrack being kind of difficult to work out where one ends and the other begins, because my idea was that that's what their world was that they were sort of projecting into their environment partly what was inside their head. So it's a kind of hyper-real, slightly kind of fantasy film, but set in a very real environment in what was everyday New York. But it was like the way that kids, I think it's what happened with, not just psychedelia but rock and roll, is that the album covers, the clothes you wear, the places you go, it's almost like you're seeing the world as a projection of the kind of the
Yeah, and I think essentially what you did, and you were the first person to, was to make geeks and nerds cool. I mean, computer programmers were not known for their sense of style, generally speaking.
Yeah, they weren't really cast like it's cast very differently to Silicon Valley.
What's interesting, the audience, a part of the audience that's picked up on it subsequently, and I've met a few of these people around Shoreditch. I mean, Shoreditch in London, which sort of became and has become the kind of hipster computer programming world. It's sort of a bit like Silicon Valley in America, but a very British version of it. But I met some of these computer programmers who Hackers was their favourite film, and they were in their 20s when it came out. And they told me that they used to take acid and program computers. I mean, the two things don't seem synonymous to me at all. But there was a kind of cool. That's the reason they really liked it, is because the first time people have made them cool.
Yeah, well, it was definitely kind of a techno trip.
The look of it, I always felt like Judge Dredd from 2000 AD. Like people wearing knee pads and stuff like that. It was very Mega City 1.
So, Guy, just picking up on this sort of inside outside, the inside of your head, and the way that was projected, and the way that we staged it and filmed it and designed it with the costumes as well, were almost like a kind of projection of their avatars. Yeah. Your two tracks were scenes where that was particularly in evidence, where they were kind of unrealistic. Yeah. They were fantasy scenes.
And so can I tell the story of my big number then? I've been dying to tell this for years. It's full of skullduggery and intrigue and cronyism, which is that I knew, because of course I should point out Gala Wright, who was at that time my girlfriend, then went on to become my wife, was Ian's assistant, and so I was living and breathing this film all day, every day anyway. And Gala would come home with all her various sort of, ups and downs with it, and so she mentioned to me that, and this is something mentioned to Simon before, the whole thing about temp tubs, when people get stuck really attached to their temp tubs, but there was the big grand central chase scene, and this had been cut to the Cure's version of Purple Haze. Now, this was this is always the problem with music in films, is because it's at the end of the film and you've run out of money. And apparently the Cure wanted an awful lot of money for the track, and that's before you started talking to the Hendrix estate, who are famously impossible. So because I was working on filmy stuff anyway at the time, and so I just had this idea. So I listened to the Cure's version of Purple Haze, and I just knocked up something that was the same tempo and the same sort of vibe. It wasn't musically the same at all. And then I bumped into you, Ian, at something. I remember I was seeing you a lot at the time, socially, what have you. And you decided to unload on me. Not unload me, that's the wrong, but you were saying, oh God, we've got real trouble. We've got this big scene and there's a song we want to use and we can't, do we? And so I said, well, actually, as it happens, Ian, I just so happen to have something that's very, very similar to that. And you went, oh, thanks, Guy, that's really kind. But, you know, I can't. And then for some stupid reason, I've no idea why, I just blurted out, I could get David Gilmour to play guitar in it. And you went, what? That'd be amazing. And I went, yeah, sure. Fuck. So I now had to go and ask David to play guitar on this track. And the thing is, we'd actually just come off a big Pink Floyd tour. Everyone was sitting around at home. David was actually very happy to be asked to do something. And I was slightly economical with the actuality. And I just said to him, I'm doing a demo. It might be for this film thing, might not. Just come play some guitar. And he was like, yeah, sure, fine. So he turned up and played just the most incredibly Gilmour-esque and brilliant bit of guitar, obviously, because we'd been on tour for months, so his chops were well up. And then when it got accepted for the film, I said, oh God, what am I going to do? And so I said, David, listen, is all right. They want to use it in this film. Is that okay? He went, yes, just don't tell anyone that it's me. So that was the deal. And the funny thing is, this, you only have to hear the first couple of bars of it, and it's just so obviously David playing guitar. And so for the last 25 years, I've just had countless people going, is that David Gilmour? And I sort of, until last year, I said nothing until I was approached to do an interview by some Hackers fans. And I went, oh, sod it, look, here's the deal. It's David Gilmour. It always was.
I just want to take your cue, Guy, and you've name-checked Gala Wright.
Yes.
And she's credited on the album with the music supervisor Bob Last. She was very good, and she when I would say I kind of like those tracks, she would get me other examples, and she was very just she's got a really good ear. And between her and Bob, Bob was very, very good in the sort of the as well. He'd done Backbeat with me, but Gala made a really big contribution to the.
Yes, and I was basically I had to live in a rave through that whole period. At home, it was just constant.
So I think this is also a good opportunity, Simon, a good opportunity for you to tell the Danny Boyle story.
Well, yeah, okay. I've had to keep this quiet for quite a while, but really because in some senses it was a bit unethical, but I was just helping him out. I mean, just the year before, 94, I'd done Shallow Grave, the score, which was his first film. So then Trainspotting comes along. And whilst I was working on the score, he was casting Trainspotting, and he had heard that Johnny Lee Miller was in Hackers, and he rang me up and said, have you got, I know this might be a bit unethical, but have you got any scenes that I can watch him, see if he's going to be right for Trainspotting? So he and Andrew McDonald came down to my studio, and I did show them a couple of scenes just to get him the job. He owes me quite a lot, actually, for that. But he wasn't aware, as far as I'm concerned, I don't think he was aware of the kind of soundtrack you were thinking of at all. So I don't think there's any direct influence in that sense. I think he was probably going out to the same clubs you were, or doing whatever you were all doing.
Well, the reason why this is, I think, an important moment for me is that this is really the first time that there's a comprehensive soundtrack album, and I'm delighted that Guy's tracks are on, which weren't on the original soundtrack album, and also, as I said, Massive Attack, and also Left Field Open Up featuring John Lydon is fantastic to have on it. But the reason, I just talk a little bit about the reason why there wasn't a more comprehensive soundtrack album, and in fact it was rushed out to accompany the UK release, and we didn't have one to accompany the US release at all, which I was incredibly disappointed about, because at that time, music and soundtrack was a big part of the marketing. What happened was that I just done a film called Backbeat, and we, it was about the Beatles in Hamburg, and we had an amazing band that was put together by the producer of the score and the soundtrack, Don Was, who was, he was doing Rolling Stones' Voodoo Lounge album at the time, so he was, his star was very, very high, and he could basically phone anybody up. So the band that we had was what they called a grunge supergroup. Dave Grohl on drums, Mike Mills, Thurston Moore, Dave Perner, and they won MTV awards for the for the tracks that they did, the covers that they did for Backbeat. So and it sold very well. So Virgin Records, who were the record company, were very interested in what I was going to do for Hackers, and we Bob Last, music supervisor, arranged a screening in LA with I think there were probably about 10 record companies, or 5 certainly, and it was a very, very uncomfortable screening, because they all came out saying they didn't like the techno. They said nobody in America is ever going to listen to techno. They said exactly. we thought it was going to be a indie guitar band soundtrack. These guys are kind of like, that's who these guys are. And I said, that's not what this film is. And so we didn't get a soundtrack, and it was the marketing department in London who decided that they could sort of rush together through Adele Records a soundtrack, which I was hugely delighted that they did, which ended up going platinum in a couple of countries. And they produced Hackers 2 and Hackers 3, which I didn't really have anything to do with the choices on those.
Inspired by the movie picture Hackers.
It's but the crazy thing is that people thought that there was a Hackers 2 movie and a Hackers 3 movie. This is the 25th anniversary this year, and on the 20th anniversary, it was the first time I'd seen the film for 20 years. And we went to New York, and Johnny Lee Miller was there, and we had screenings in LA, and we re-released the film in 13 cities in the States, and we were only expecting to do one screening. And the thing that was great about it, apart from seeing Andrei Sekula, well known for Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs, is photography, which on 35mm, which just looks unbelievable, so rich, was the soundtrack. And I'd forgotten how much music there is in the film, and how the soundtrack in the film drives the experience, and it envelops you. And I think that and the music hasn't dated. Any of the music hasn't dated. What you guys did, the tracks. And the other thing that people pick up on, that even though the technology is very kind of quaint, and archaic, and sort of download speeds that are referred to often get a little kind of, a little kind of giggle, in the same way that a brick telephone would in a film. But a lot of the idea of this was a kind of equivalent rock and roll way of escaping into a new counterculture. That's what I was interested in the film. I wasn't making a technology film. I was making a film about counterculture, and that's what people were not talking about. And it's not. I can't take credit for that, because the people we were talking to, the designers, the graphic designers, the technology designers, they were telling us that this is what it was going to be, that it was going to be this kind of social thing, it was going to be hip, it was going to be a counterculture, it was going to be creatively innovative. So that's what we picked up on, and I think that's what people recognize now when they look at the film, was that even though a lot of the things we kind of stated in terms of the technology became outdated very, very quickly, that idea of a kind of a counterculture of this world that you live in, this online world that we all, in different degrees live in now, that was not really being recognized or discussed at the time.